welcome to all of you, and thank you all very much for agreeing to be team leads for this year's 2017 Foster Youth Education Summit Legislative Visits. This webinar this morning is designed to give you all a briefing on the different bills that we're going to be lobbying on this year and what to expect from the visits. So to start, I'm going to go over some technical details about this morning's webinar. So the webinar is being recorded. If you decide you would like to listen to it again, it will be available, and I'll send out the link to everybody, and I will also send out the PowerPoint presentation to everyone later today. If you have a question during the webinar, there's a couple of different ways that you can communicate that. So one is on the questions panel on your control panel, and you can type in any question that you have at any time and send that over to me. And so certainly if you have any kind of logistical or technical issues that come up, feel free to shoot those over at any time. There's also going to be a couple of points during the webinar where I will ask specifically if folks have questions about the different bills. There is a function within GoToWebinar. You can see on your control panel, there's a little icon of a hand with an arrow. If you click on this, that virtually raises your hand, and it then allows me to go in and unmute you. So if you're calling in by phone, it doesn't always work if you're listening through your computer. So it works more often if you're calling in via the telephone. But if you do want to be able, so if you want to be able to ask a question out loud, you might want to consider calling in versus listening on the phone. But either way, you can always send your questions in via the chat mechanism. So the agenda for this morning's webinar is we're going to go over the schedule for the Ledge visits. We're going to talk about the different teams that are going to be created. We're going to walk through the 3 specific bills that we're going to be lobbying on, and then go through some general tips to help you through this process. So to start out, the schedule for the day. So the visits, as you I believe all know, are scheduled to take place during workshop session E. And so this is on the second day of the Ed Summit on Wednesday the 19th. And workshop session E starts at 11:15. So the session prior to it, session D, ends at 11. So we expect everybody to be in the room by 11:15. We'll spend the first 30 minutes getting into teams. Now, the youth who will be participating are going to receive an orientation the day before. So they will have already been prepped on the bills. We're going to ask them to figure out in advance which bill that they want to speak to. So they'll have all that information ready to go. So this time from 11:15 to 11:45 is really just sort of grouping people together, grouping youth with the team leads and such. And then you'll spend just a little bit of time sort of making sure everybody knows what their role is and who's going to say what. 11:45 to noon is walking over to the Capitol, and then the visit itself is scheduled, for the most part, the visits are 12 to 12:30. There's a couple of staff that weren't available until 12:15, so a couple of them will start a little bit later. So you're only going to be doing one visit this year, which is a little bit different than what we've done in the past, where teams have typically done a couple or maybe 3 visits. And because we decided to do this during an actual workshop session, in order for us to do more than one visit, we would have had to push into lunchtime, and we didn't want to do that. So it's going to be a pretty brief legislative visit experience. You're just going to go meet with one legislator and then come back to the conference. You're going to hand in the tracking sheet, which I will talk about later on what that is, the feedback sheet rather. And then lunch begins at 12:45. So even those of you that end up doing visits that start a little bit later, even the very latest, you should be back by 1 o'clock, and we will make sure that, that there's plenty of lunch available for those of you who get back a little bit later. So the way that we're anticipating the teams, and this is our hope, and we'll see how it all sort of works out in practice. Teams will have 4 members each. So there will be you, the team captain, and then there will be 3 youth on the team. And there are 3 issues that we're speaking to. And so we're going to try to set this up in a way where there's 1 youth on your team who's prepared to speak to each issue. So that's the plan. However, one thing I just wanted to say is, just in case, we're asking that you sort of spend a little time becoming versed on the 3 issues, so that if for some reason a youth doesn't show up, or once they get there gets cold feet or something like that, that you're able to always step in at least give a brief overview of the issues, just in case. So as I mentioned before, the teams will prep together from 11:15 to 11:45, and you should use this time to identify the roles within the team. As I mentioned before, the youth members will have been prepped for the visits the day before, and you'll mostly just be confirming, okay, John, you're going to talk about SB 12, and Mary, you're going to talk about SB 233, and Joe, you're going to talk about the budget request. Make sure you walk to the Capitol as a team to avoid getting separated. For those of you who have done this before, you know that the Capitol building itself is a bit of a maze and can be confusing, so we want to make sure you stay together as a team. And then Diana Glick from the Judicial Council has volunteered to sort of be our point person on the ground, and you'll have all this information with her phone number and everything. We'll have handouts for you the day of, so you don't need to worry about writing this down or anything. But she's going to be available. You can call or text her at any point if you run into any problems sort of during the visits while it's happening. So who are you going to be meeting with? We're still finalizing who the meetings are going to be taking place with, but you're going to be meeting with members of the Senate and Assembly from the Education Committee, the Human Services Committee, and the Budget Committee. And these are the committees that are charged with hearing the various bills that we're going to be addressing. And one of the things that we will have for you is information about when any individual member is going to be hearing any particular bill next. So for example, with SB 12, SB 12 has already been heard by the Senate Education Committee, and it's scheduled to go to the Senate Human Services Committee on April 25th. And so if you're meeting with a member of the Senate Human Services Committee, you will have a piece of paper that says for that particular member when, you know, that they're going to be hearing this bill in Human Services Committee, so that you can let them know when they can expect to see the bill come their way. And we're meeting with the Budget Committee members as well, because as we'll get into shortly, in addition to 2 bills, one of the issues that we're going to be lobbying on is actually a budget request. So I'm going to jump into going over the first of the bills, which is Senate Bill 12, which is about post-secondary education and financial aid assistance. So the author of this bill is Senator Jim Bell, and the sponsor is my organization, John Burton Advocates for Youth. And the goal of the bill in general is to increase the rate of Pell receipt among foster youth in foster care. So what was the motivation for us to do this bill? We did a report back in 2015 where we looked at data from the community college system. And one of the most startling pieces of information that we found was that there was a huge gap in the number of foster youth who were receiving what's called the BOG fee waiver, which is the Board of Governors fee waiver that allows low-income students to not have to pay tuition fees, and the Pell Grant, which is the federal financial aid source, which for a full-time student is about $5,800. So it's a significant amount of money. And so the eligibility criteria in terms of income is basically the same for the Pell Grant and the BOG fee waiver. So we realized that there's something going on here where there's actually quite a few foster youth who should be qualifying to get a Pell Grant because we know that they're meeting the qualification for the BOG fee waiver, and yet we see this big gap in the number of foster youth who are getting the Pell Grant. And after talking with folks, we came to the conclusion that there's a number of different reasons for that, and primarily just a lot of logistical barriers that foster youth face when they're trying to get through the process of getting a Pell Grant, because the Pell Grant is more complicated. You have to fill out a FAFSA, the federal financial aid form, which tends to be a significantly more complicated process than what is needed to just get the BOG fee waiver. So why is the low rate of Pell Grant receipt among foster youth problematic? We know from research that parental earnings is the #1 way that college is paid for in the US, and that even holds true when just looking at low-income students. And of course, foster youth don't typically have parents available to help pay for college. We did a survey of students and asked them a question about the impact that having the Pell Grant had on their ability to attend college. And we found that 36% of those who received a Pell Grant would likely reduce their course load, and 42% expressed that they would probably need to disenroll entirely if they didn't have the Pell Grant. So it's obviously very important for students to have this to be able to stay in school. Chafee funding, which is available to foster youth, is fixed regardless of demand. So there's just a certain amount of money that's available, and once it runs out, nobody else can get that money. Whereas the Pell Grant is an entitlement. So as many people apply for the grant that qualify can get it. It doesn't run out. So it's a really vital source of financial aid. And then there's been a lot of research showing the impact of financial aid as a predictor of retention and degree completion. So 49% of low-income students who received more than $7,500 in aid graduated, compared to 17% of those who received between $1,000 and $2,500. So you can see that there's a huge impact of receiving financial aid on the likelihood of completion. So what does SB 12 propose to do? The problem, as we already talked about, is that evidence shows that financial aid is a strong predictor of degree attainment, and yet only 50% of foster youth attending community colleges are receiving a Pell Grant. So the bill has 3 different avenues to address this. The first provision says that every county child welfare agency would be required to identify a person to assist foster youth with applications for post-secondary education and financial aid. So one thing that we have found within the child welfare system is that there's nobody who's clearly identified as the person to assist a foster youth with filling out the FAFSA. So if a foster youth is in high school, the social worker thinks the caregiver is doing it, and the caregiver thinks ILP is doing it, and the ILP thinks that the high school counselor is doing it, and it turns out that nobody's doing it. So this would make sure that it's not that we're expecting child welfare social workers to become experts on completing the FAFSA and financial aid, but they would know the resources that are available, whether it's high school counselors or the financial aid office at the college or the independent living program, and they would make sure that there's somebody who's been identified to play this role. The second provision is streamlining the financial aid verification process for foster youth who apply through the FAFSA. So foster youth, for those who aren't as familiar with how the FAFSA process works, foster youth, if they were in care at any point after the age of 13, are entitled to something called independent status, which means they don't have to report income from their parents. And so this is a huge benefit. And if they indicate that they were in foster care in order to get independent status, typically the college requires them to bring in verification. So they have to track down paper verification and then physically bring it into the college, perhaps wait in line at the financial aid office, turn in the verification. And this is a place where a lot of foster youth sort of fall through the cracks in this process. So what this bill would do would be to automate that process, similar to something that already exists for the Chafee Grant program, where CDSS, the Department of Social Services, would send a list over to the California State Aid Commission of foster youth, and then colleges could do an automated verification of foster care status so they don't have to ask the students to bring in that paper verification anymore. And then the last provision is expanding an existing on-campus-based support program. So there is a relatively new program called CAFES, which was enacted a couple of years ago through Senate Bill 1023, which is within the EOPS programs at colleges, which is the community colleges programs for educationally disadvantaged students. There's now a program within that that's targeted specifically for foster youth. And the original legislation capped the number of campuses that could participate at 10 community college districts. The budget allocation is enough that that could actually be expanded within the current budget allocation. So the bill would increase the number of districts who can participate in that program from 10 up to 20. And so that program really plays a vital role once students are at the college in helping them with the financial aid process and making sure that they're getting all the aid for which they're eligible. So those are sort of the big picture overview of what the bill does. Now, what we're going to be asking the students to do is to not just go to these meetings and talk about in very generic ways what the bill will do, but to also talk from their own experience and use their own experience to speak to why the bill is important and necessary. So these talking points that are on your screen right now are the talking points that we're going to be giving to the youth during their training the day before. So we're going to ask them to think about how financial aid has made it possible for them to attend college, maybe what some of the barriers that they faced, if they had any difficulties applying for financial aid, what those were like, if they got help to apply for financial aid, who helped them and how it made a difference, how financial aid is making it possible for them to attend college, or if they participate in some type of campus support program, how that program has helped them. So the idea is they will be mulling this question over the day before and thinking about what it is that they want to speak to. So then when they get together with you, they'll also already have a notion in place about some particular experience that they've had in their own life that they can use to illustrate the importance of the bill. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Angela from the National Center for Youth Law, who's going to talk with us about the second issue that we're going to be addressing, which is SB 233. I haven't seen any questions come in about SB 12 at this point, but certainly if you do have questions, go ahead and send them in. I think we'll just take any questions that might come up at the end. So Angela?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me, Debbie?
Yes, sound great.
Great. All right. So SB 233 is a bill regarding the sharing of education records with non-education rights holding caregivers. So the author is Senator Jim Beal, and the bill is being co-sponsored by 3 organizations. So National Center for Youth Law, which is my organization, the Alliance for Children's Rights, as well as Public Counsel. And really the primary objective of SB 233 is to clarify existing state law around the types of education records that caregivers who are not holding education rights, that they may directly access those types of records from school districts to support the educational needs of foster youth. So next slide. Right, so there is a lack of clarity in existing state law around what types of education records that foster youth caregivers are allowed to access, particularly when, concretely when they are not the education rights holder. However, state law does give responsibilities to the caregiver, whether or not they're education right holders, for addressing foster youth's daily educational needs, which makes sense. So in order to clarify sort of this idea that foster youth caregivers, in order to meet those responsibilities around supporting foster youth education needs on a daily basis, SB 233 is an attempt to help caregivers access directly that education information from school districts themselves. So the problem is largely that any information that is sort of held by school districts around, attendance, grades, those things, districts have often shared that they are not sure that they are allowed to directly share that with caregivers themselves. So they're pretty clear now with existing legislation that they can share directly with social workers, and of course they can share directly with the child's education rights holders, but caregivers who aren't education right holders occupy a sort of gray area. So the SB 233 will help make sure that caregivers, again, can really support foster youth students in their daily education needs for things like tutoring or sort of coordinating other education supports, things that they sort of need to be in communication with directly with school districts around foster youth students. Next slide. So again, similar to the previous bill, sort of thinking in terms of talking points for the visits, the question that we'd really like folks to think about before visiting with legislatures is to think about your own experiences and the experiences of youth that you've worked with in terms of how caregivers who weren't education right holders supported or weren't able to support education, particularly as it relates to being able to access information directly from a school. And really think through how that either positively affected your education if you had a caregiver who was really active in sort of looking at education progress, looking at your grades, looking at your attendance, and sort of holding that space for you for education, or if you sort of had a caregiver who wasn't as active, who didn't really support education, wasn't in communication with the school about sort of your needs or your experiences in the school and how that impacted your long-term education trajectory. And, think about sort of both your own experiences as well as giving general information about the foster youth achievement gap. We have found that sort of legislators and legislative staff still, continuing to need to be educated about the foster youth achievement gap in education and how foster youth sort of continue to fall behind their peers, even other low-income students. And so that it's really important for, the adults in their lives, particularly caregivers, to have the information that they need to support foster youth in, closing that educational equity gap.
Hi, everyone. This is Martin Schwartz, and I'm going to be talking about the budget request this year. So I want to begin by talking about what the goal here is. And the goal is to reduce caseloads for attorneys in the child welfare system to make them more effective advocates for system-involved youth. Next slide, please. And before I frame the problem, I just want to give you a little bit of context. Attorneys play a critical role in affecting better outcomes for system-involved youth. Among other things, attorneys are charged with ensuring that placements are safe and healthy. They're charged with making sure the medical and psychological needs of youth are being met. They're charged with making sure the educational needs of youth are being addressed, and they're charged with making sure that the trauma that brought youth into the system to begin with is mitigated. So the problem is that high caseloads for lawyers means that lawyers are going to know less about every child's specific situation, which in turn makes them less effective advocates for system-involved youth, resulting theoretically in less favorable outcomes for youth. And at today's funding levels, because of today's funding levels, the caseload average statewide is nearly twice the maximum allowable caseload as determined by the California Judicial Council. So this year's budget request is to ask for $22 million in ongoing funding. Now, that's only about a quarter of the money needed for full funding, and I'll explain what that means in a little bit, but it's the most we can hope for in this year's budget cycle, and the hope is that additional funding will reduce caseloads, enhance advocacy, and improve outcomes. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about, so this slide represents the current state of funding. Full funding, and I'll explain what that means in just a minute. Full funding of child welfare attorneys would cost around $202 million. Currently, the program is only funded at $114 million. And again, the request this year is to increase funding by $22 million on an ongoing basis. Currently, funding is stuck at about 56% of total need statewide. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, the Judicial Council determined that the optimal caseload for attorneys handling child welfare cases is about 77 cases, while the absolute maximum is 141 cases. Based on current funding of $114 million, caseload averages statewide are about 268 cases per attorney. And I just want to give some perspective to what that means and what the practical result of that is in the courtroom and in the dependency system. So just imagine you were an attorney carrying a statewide average caseload of about 268 cases. Think about just on a real basic level how difficult it would be just to remember the names of all of your clients. And then think about having to know the names of their parents and their siblings. Think about adding to that another layer of an in-depth understanding of their placements, where they go to school, their educational needs, their medical needs, their psychological needs, their familial case plans, family visitation, and what the situation was that brought them into the system to begin with. And I think if you think about it in that context, it's easier to understand that it's very difficult to advocate effectively for system-involved youth when sheer caseload numbers make it difficult to have an in-depth knowledge of their individual circumstances. So next slide, please. So the hope, again, is to get closer to full funding by requesting about a quarter of the money that's needed to get there. When youth are talking to legislators about this, I think it would be helpful if youth talked about the role that their attorney played or did not play in the court process. So I think it would be important to have youth explain whether or not their attorneys were able to help mitigate some of the anxiety that they felt about possible outcomes in court, and whether their attorney was able to help them understand what was happening in court. I think it's also important for youth to consider discussing whether or not they would have liked to have greater access to their lawyer. So for example, did they feel that they did not have as much access to their attorney because their attorney was too busy. You know, it's also probably important to get youth perspective on whether they believe their attorney would have been a more effective advocate for them if they were able to dig deeper into their own specific situation. So, for example, would greater contact with their attorney have made a difference in staying in a placement or coming out of a placement, increasing family visits, or being able to remain in their school of origin? Those are just some of the talking point suggestions on this budget request. And with that, I'll turn it over to Debbie.
Great, thank you. So that's a quick overview of the 3 issues. I'm not seeing nobody sent in questions. There is one person who has a hand raised, but I'm not sure if that was by mistake or was intentional. So why don't, if you do have a question, I think it's probably best if you type it in, and then I can go ahead and unmute you. If that's something you want, you can indicate that in the question. All right, I'm not seeing any questions coming in about any of the bills at this point. So, you know, I'm gonna move along with some more kind of logistical, technical information, but certainly if you think of questions about any of the 3 issues that we just went over, you can definitely go ahead and send those in through the question panel. So getting back to some of the logistics. So the vision for what these visits will look like is you'll start out by introducing the group. And so we ask that you say that you're here at a conference with the California Foster Youth Education Summit, and that these are foster youth students who are participating in the conference, and just sort of give a little bit of background about who we are. And then again, the hope is that we'll have one youth speak on each bill, and hopefully this will work out. And if it doesn't work out exactly as we planned, we'll sort of have to go with the flow and maybe have a youth talk about 2 bills if there aren't enough, or maybe kind of split the responsibilities if we have more youth than we have visits. So I'm hoping that you all can be flexible on the day of and sort of work with us around figuring that out during that first 30 minutes of prep time that you have. But the goal is that each youth speaks on 1 bill. And so we're going to be giving them kind of an outline, which will basically say the first thing that we ask them to do is, if they're comfortable, share a few words about their experience in foster care. And we're going to, at the youth training on Tuesday, we'll talk a little bit about, you know, making sure that they understand that they shouldn't share anything that they don't feel comfortable talking about, and that it's purely optional, and you know, making sure that they're clear about, you know, sort of that they're the ultimate decision maker when it comes to sharing information about their lives. And then we'll have them describe the problem that the bill is designed to address and how the bill will address the problem. And again, this will be written out for them on the talking point sheet, and it'll basically be the overview information that we just provided you today. We'll ask them to share some sort of personal experience based on those talking points that we just went over, and then ask them to ask the person that they're meeting with if the member has taken a position on a bill or not. And then there'll be an opportunity, of course, for questions from the staff person with whom you're meeting. If questions come up that you don't have the answer for during the meeting, of course, we ask that you don't make anything up. And there's going to be a tracking sheet that I'm going to actually show you a picture of on the next slide that we will give you that will enable you to record the information about the question, and you can just tell the staff person that somebody will follow up with them. And so this is the tracking sheet that we're going to ask you to fill out. So it's pretty straightforward. Your name is the team captain, the name of the member, meaning the senator, assembly member, the staff person that you met with, because in most cases you won't be actually meeting with the member themselves, you'll be meeting with one of their staff. whether you were able to cover all three of the issues, and then if the member expressed either position of support, opposition, the member wasn't sure, or if for some reason it's not applicable if you didn't get to that issue or something. So you'll indicate on the form any feedback you got from the member. If there's any information that you think might be helpful for the bill sponsors to know for future lobbying, you can record that there. So for example, I was in a meeting once with a legislator who was a Republican, and it turned out that he himself was a foster parent and met with us himself and told us that he's always supportive of anything related to foster care. And so he wasn't necessarily one of our usual allies that we think of, so we made a note of that for the bill sponsors to know that information about him. And then there's a space for any follow-up needed. So again, if the person you're meeting with has a specific question that you can't answer or wants some sort of additional information, you can make a note of that as well, and the bill sponsors will make sure to follow up on that. So before I go on to a little bit more general tips and information, there is a comment that came in that I want to share. For attorney caseloads, I think it is important to underscore that the maximum for caseloads is what is required for a minimal level of advocacy on behalf of the youth in foster care. So I think that the point that's being made here is that the maximum caseload is the minimum that's required, and in fact that existing attorney caseloads are well above the maximum. They're not even at the recommended, even with this budget augmentation, caseloads wouldn't be at the recommended level. We're just trying to get them a little bit closer even to the maximum level to be effective. And then I have another question that's come in here. Sorry, I'm having a moment with my screen. So just a comment that many youth might be less familiar with the scope of the role that the attorney plays and the role of the attorney in charge with serving, the role that the attorney is charged with given these large caseloads. And so a lot of times the students are more familiar with their social workers. And so there's just a comment to say that it's very powerful. It will be very powerful for them to understand that they have an attorney available to them to engage as well as part of their team. So thank you for that comment. So back to sort of some of the general tips for a successful visit. So we do ask that you prepare ahead of time by reading the informational materials and talking points. So after the webinar today, I'm going to be sending you electronic versions of there's going to be fact sheets for each one of the three bills and then talking points for each one of the three bills. I'm saying bills, one of them is a budget request, but I'm using bills just as kind of shorthand. So we do ask that you spend a few minutes reviewing that and making sure that you are prepared to speak on each of the three issues in the event that the youth is unable to. Make sure you use the time prior to leaving the Capitol to develop the outline of the visit, and we'll remind you of that once we all convene on Wednesday. If you have a personal story that you want to share to help the member or his staff understand the issue, you should feel free to do that as well. You're there mostly to guide the youth, but you obviously, also all of you on this call, work closely with foster youth and have probably witnessed a lot of these issues firsthand, and you shouldn't feel like you can't say anything. You absolutely should feel free to chime in with your own stories as well. As I mentioned before, please do make sure to ask the young person to ask the person that you're meeting with whether they support the bill and record that information on the tracking sheet. Do stay on topic and try not to bring up unrelated issues. This is a big one that I want to emphasize because I definitely have seen this come up in meetings, and the amount of time that we have with the youth to prep them is pretty limited. It's not as long as I think we would like to have. And so I have seen situations where both youth and adults decide to sort of bring their own agenda into the meeting and talk about something completely unrelated to the bills, and often something where a legislative staff member has no control over. And so that's, I think, frustrating for everybody involved. So as much as you can to try to help the conversation stay on track, unless if the member themselves or the staff person you're meeting with brings up another issue, that's sort of a different story. But for you and the other members of your team to really try to stay on track is helpful for everybody involved. We will provide you with a folder that has fact sheets in it to leave with the person that you're meeting with. So just make sure you remember to drop that off with them. If you happen to live, work, or go to school in the member's district, absolutely let them know that. We don't have the logistical capacity, unfortunately, to try to link people to members that they have an association with the district. But if by some chance that turns out to be the case, definitely let them know, because that's really important. If you end up being able to meet with the member themselves, feel free to ask for a picture. If you do end up getting a picture taken, we recommend that you send a copy to the member's office, because sometimes they like to include that on their own websites or social media outlets. And if you do forward a picture, include the date, the name of your group, and the names of those who appear in the picture. Couple of don'ts on our tip list. Don't be disappointed if you are meeting with a staff member rather than the members themselves. The members, it's an extremely busy time of year, and they're often in committee hearings or various other things. So chances are very, very high that you will be meeting with a staff person. The staff are in constant communication with their members, and they absolutely will convey the information that you share with them to the member. Don't be surprised if the meeting ends up in an unexpected location. Sometimes the offices are very, very small. There's a huge range in the size of offices. Sometimes the offices are very small. Sometimes the rooms that are available within a member's office are already being used for something else. And so meetings can take place in the hallway. They can take place in the cafeteria. That's very normal. It happens a lot, and it doesn't mean anything about the importance that the person you're meeting with has given to your particular meeting. So don't take it personally, and don't worry about it if that happens. Don't exceed the time you've been given for the visit. So the visits are all scheduled for 30 minutes. If for some reason we know in advance that the meeting has to cut short of that, we'll let you know that. But it's important to stay within that time frame, because everybody's on a very tight schedule. Don't bring any gifts to the members. The members are subject to strict rules about accepting gifts, and this can cause an awkward situation if somebody were to bring a gift. That is the end of the presentation. Let's see. I've got one question that's come in. Can you clarify the amount of time we have for the visit? Yes, the visits are expected to be 30 minutes. So most of them will be scheduled to begin at noon and end at about 12:30. There's a couple that I think we might have to schedule for 12:15, but even in those cases, 30 minutes is the expected time frame for the visits. If anybody else has questions, I'm not seeing any come in, but I'm going to wait a few minutes in case one of you out there is furiously typing away with your question. As a reminder, please make sure you show up on time, or ideally even early to the room. It's going to be a little chaotic, and we'll do our best to keep things moving along in an organized fashion, but we know that all of you are ready to be flexible in the event that things have to change last minute, because sometimes with this legislative work, that does happen. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So as I mentioned before, y'all will be getting an email from me with this PowerPoint presentation, the link to the recording, and the various other information that we'll be providing you. You will then have my email address if you don't already, and you can certainly feel free to shoot me any other questions that you think of between now and next week. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing all of you at the Ed Summit. I want to say thank you again to Angela and Martin for great presentations on those two issues. And thank you to all of you for being here today and helping us out with this next week. So this ends the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.